It doesn't matter how you passed. If you are a sex worker, you are known to the sex work community, you will be grieved, you will be recognized, you will be honored by sex workers all over the world on this day.
Welcome back to On the Horizon. This is Melrose Michaels. I am your host, and I'm here to share what's worked for me in building my adult creator business to try to make building yours just a little bit easier. Let's get into today's episode. Today's episode is a powerful and deeply important one. I'm joined by Kaytlin Bailey, comedian, writer, advocate, and the brilliant mind behind the oldest profession podcast in SWCEO. As the founder of Old Pros, Kaytlin has dedicated her life to using storytelling to fight for sex workers' rights and bring humanity to their history. With today being International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, we're diving into the historical significance of this day, the ongoing challenges sex workers face, and the inspiring ways that they're advocating for change. Today, you're in for an eye-opening and thought-provoking conversation, and I truly couldn't be more grateful to focus our last live space and podcast episode of the year around something so truly incredibly important. With all of that said, allow me to introduce today's guest, Kaytlin Bailey. So Kaytlin Bailey is a comedian, writer, and advocate for sex workers' rights. She's the founder and executive director of Old Pros, a nonprofit that uses storytelling to advocate for sex workers' rights. She hosts the Oldest Profession podcast, and Kaytlin also created and is currently touring SWCEO, a comedic mad dash through 10,000 years of history from a sex worker's perspective. Her work has been featured in major outlets like the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and Vice, and she is a leading voice in the movement for decriminalization on sex work. Kaytlin, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us today. I'm so stoked to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and a great honor to be here today.
Yes. I think that it's just such a treat to have you who has so much historical insight into our community. So I want to, start for anyone who might be new to your work, if you could share a little bit about the Old Pros and kind of what inspired you to start SWCEO and the Oldest Profession podcast.
Sure. So my professional background is in stand-up comedy. I spent 15 years touring the country, telling jokes and in basements. But in 2018, when Donald Trump signed SESTA FOSTA into law, I got activated around this issue. So I started the Oldest Profession podcast really to push back against this terrible narrative that be doing sex work or becoming a sex worker is like the worst thing that you can be, and it resigns you to sort of a life of struggle or suffering or like somebody to be pitied. And once I started looking for notable old pros through history, right, entrepreneurs, innovators, artists, I just kept finding them. And so we're going into our 6th season now of the Oldest Profession podcast. And that podcast has really evolved into a whole nonprofit media organization that pushes back against the stories and the false narratives that have led to this, this horrific stigma and silence and shame and ultimately our criminalization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like this is a good point to tell everyone who's tuning in and who's going to listen to this episode from the get-go to make sure that like when you see Kaytlin Bailey in this Twitter space, like to click follow on her socials now because she's so informative. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, especially that we all stay connected with the people that are having these kinds of conversations and that have this kind of information. So I want to stress that even ahead of getting into the episode because I think International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers is such an important day for our community. I want to ask you to kind of express what this day means to you personally, if you don't mind sharing.
Sure. So, I mean, really, it's difficult to overstate the significance of this day. It really has held sort of the global sex worker rights community together for the last 25 years, which is, 21 years. And so I was first introduced to December 17th when I was a baby activist in like 2015, 2016. I was just really mad about, all of the wrong things that people were saying about sex work. And I started attending conferences and events. And very quickly, I was invited to attend a December 17th event. And I remember it was at Judson Memorial Church, and all of these amazing people came together, and we thoughtfully made these beautiful candles and wrote all of these names down. And I would come later to understand that this was the names of all of those that we've lost in the community this year. Because so often when people come out as a sex worker or are outed as a sex worker, they lose their community. And so when they pass, sometimes they aren't given the honor that they deserve. And so our community comes together to hold space for all of the people that we've lost. And in so doing, it brings sex workers together to do a very sacred thing, which is grieve. And as you mentioned earlier in the podcast about how isolating this work is, just the nature of the work itself, and also the stigma that often keeps us isolated from each other and our communities, moments that bring us together to hold space, to break bread, to share is really, really powerful. And out of the initial December 17th, which we'll talk about, which happened in 2003, that initial ceremony, that ritual, that vigil planted the seeds that eventually became SWAP USA. And ever since then, this event has served to bring new people into this community and strengthen the ties of the people that do this work all over the world.
Absolutely. I think this is a great segue into even just speaking to the historical
Mm-hmm.
significance of this day. And could you kind of explain how this became recognized, like how this came to be?
Sure. Yeah, so this event, December 17th, was chosen because it was the day of sentencing around the Green River serial killer, who was an unfortunately prolific serial killer who operated in Seattle, Washington for decades, targeting sex workers. He's on record of doing this from a place of like vitriol. He hated sex workers, and also he believed, and he was correct, that if he targeted sex workers, he'd be able to get away with it for a long time because police officers in the community uh, don't take violence against sex workers seriously. And so this whole day is really about helping to show the larger community what it would take to end violence against us. And it's not ending our livelihood, right? We will not make violence against sex workers go away by pursuing efforts to make sex work go away. And so Annie Sprinkle, right, longtime sex worker rights advocate, one of the original founding members of Club 90, a porn advocacy group that was operating in the 70s and 80s, worked with Robyn Few, who would go on to create SWAP USA, to conceive of this public ritual. Now, Annie Sprinkle is a performance artist, and she has a lot of deep knowledge. She is still doing public rituals around ecosexuality and helping people like marry the earth. And so this was very much in that vein. But from the beginning, even in 2003, there was a real effort to invite the press and the outside community so that they could come and bear witness and see how we keep each other safe. So Annie Sprinkle and Robyn Few and sex workers on the West Coast invited the families of the victims who'd been lost to this horrible serial killer, and they gathered together and did what many people still do today, which is they light candles and they read the names of those that have been lost, highlighting how the criminalization and the stigma and the shame and the silence around sex work made all of us more vulnerable to this kind of horrific violence. Since then, SWAP USA exists. One of the main things that they do is they keep a list, and so they are in touch with sex worker advocacy groups all over the world, compiling a list of names of those that we've lost, and some identifying information like age, location, and cause of death if it's available. And it's evolved, right? The definition of violence has evolved, and who we grieve. And so we lose some people still to horrific interpersonal violence. We lose people to to drug addiction. We lose people to cancer. We lose people to natural causes. But it doesn't matter how you passed. If you are a sex worker, you are known to the sex work community, you will be grieved, you will be recognized, you will be honored by sex workers all over the world on this day. And so we come together in different spaces. Some people do this privately, which I think is really, really beautiful. You can still be a part of community. In fact, from the very first day, Annie and Robyn and several other collaborators put together a list of ways that you can participate in this, even if you can't get yourself to community. Running a bath, lighting a candle, saying the names to yourself privately, even just taking a private moment to recognize that you are part of this legacy, or to honor our ancestors, and in this case our most recent ancestors in this work. And it's very powerful. It connects, for 20 years now, sex workers coming together to light these candles and say these names. It's really been a prayer of resilience.
If you're enjoying this podcast episode so far, please take one moment to share it with another one of your adult content creator friends, because you know what the rule is here. We do not gatekeep, and we want to make as many adult creators' businesses as easy as possible. And you sharing this episode with them might do exactly that. Thanks so much in advance.
Absolutely. You spoke to something that I think stands out, which is where the press was invited to kind of bear witness. And I think that has so many parallels to even the work you do. So, like, the way your work shines a light on the history of sex workers and their contributions to just society at large. I'm wondering, how does your understanding of history also impact and shape the fight for rights and recognition today?
Yeah, so that's a big question, but I want to start with December 17th. So part of Annie and Robyn and the rest of the crew's intention was to deliberately shift the narrative. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, right, the United States is still very much grappling with the moral panic that was in response to the AIDS epidemic. This is the height of the satanic panic and stranger danger. And much like today, this notion of trafficking, right, was being manipulated and used to pass policies that hurt the people they intended to help, right? So there's a lot of laws passed around making it harder to be a sex worker that was sold to the American people as a way of protecting us from our own choices, right? And we see that same kind of language around, conversations around abortion or access to contraception or medically accurate sex education, right? That ignorance is some kind of protection, or preventing people from being able to make or keep money somehow reduces the likelihood that they'll be raped and kidnapped by a horrible predator. And of course, we know that that isn't true, but it's difficult to break through that media narrative. But there's something about the energy of a vigil, right, that shifts the conversation from focusing on the horrible predator, right? Whether you're talking about the Green River serial killer or the legacy of Jack the Ripper, and onto the humanity of these victims, right? Annie invited their families together, right? These are not nameless, faceless, insert, your horrible stereotypes here. These are real people that were part of real communities. And when sex workers come together and we talk about the very real concerns that we have about our safety and health, it becomes a little bit harder to ignore our incredibly reasonable demands, and pointing out the hypocrisy, or pointing out the obvious problems with trying to get a criminalized class of people to feel comfortable reporting threats against us, violence committed against us, or crimes committed against us, or that we witness. And so holding a vigil, humanizing those that we've lost, and passing the mic to the sex workers who are alive help to genuinely shift the media narrative from the way that it was sort of sensationalized in the 1990s and 2000s, and created a lot of space for sex workers to make themselves heard by journalists, producers, and media makers. And we've really seen the fruits of that labor over the last couple of decades, as more and more sex workers are not just telling their story, because we've always been telling our story, but being heard in a particular way.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about just violence against sex workers, we can't do so without realizing and validating the fact that it's a deeply rooted issue.
Mm-hmm.
So from your perspective, what are the most like pressing challenges that sex workers face in terms of just safety and protection?
Yeah, unfortunately, we are still fighting against what I would argue would be sort of a new resurgence of a very old lie, right? Which is that protecting people, but specifically women, from sex and their ability to make their own choices about sex, their ability to have control over their own bodies, their ability to like own their own eroticism is somehow protection. We've confused over the last, several hundred years, prohibition with protection. And I think what the Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers does, and I think what sex workers telling their own stories helps to do, is push back against that narrative and highlight the things that we are actually asking for, instead of this sort of like reactionary backlash to women's general erotic power. Now, of course, people of all genders participate in this work, and people that participate in this work deal with whorephobia. But so much of whorephobia is grounded in this 6,000-year campaign to control women's bodies and sexuality specifically. And so in the show, and some of the work that I do tracing the sort of narrative evolution of sex workers, is to go back to the sacred whore and look at how, priestesses or people engaging in this work in the ancient world, which is really the glue. Like we built the foundations of civilization. We domesticated plants and animals. We invented, script. We tamed fire. We gave people a reason to come together without killing one another. And how that sacred, vital, life affirming role comes to be demonized, right? In the wake of patriarchy and an obsession with paternity, right? An obsession with property and control and violence. And when we replace fertility deities with these war gods, right? And that takes us into sort of the Persian, Greek, and Roman Empire. And then that further transition into, the Christian church, right? Which sort of completes the demonization of the sacred whore and wages war, right? Like, so the war against heretics is in many ways a war against these older religions, and creates an institution that is more committed to stripping women of their property rights and hunting homosexuals than to spreading the good news about infinite forgiveness, or some of the messages that, Jesus himself was tasked with bringing into this world. Then you see that like rich, vast cultural legacy of demonization, right? That is so grounded in misogyny and so grounded in coercive control, just effortlessly transition into concepts around disease, right? When the scientific revolution, ostensibly sort of replaces big church with these other institutions, we are pathologizing promiscuity. We are pathologizing what we, of course, many of us know to be very normal, healthy expressions of sexuality and sensuality. And that disease model, and the demonization, sort of conspires with the new technology that we have access to, and the moral panics around that eradicating sex work becomes synonymous with protecting women and girls from violence. And nothing could be further from the truth, because the way that we police prostitution is we actually strip people, right? But especially women, especially queer folk, members of the LGBTQ plus community, of freedom of movement, freedom of expression. And so, yeah, that's that long arc of history. And we see these patterns emerge over and over and over again, of like a new technology makes it possible for people to connect in new ways. People have a panic about that, blame, promiscuity or feminism or, freedom of expression as like the root cause. And then we justify some often violent prohibition attempts and conflate it with protection. But of course, anyone who's done this work or any member of a stigmatized or criminalized class knows that an increase in police presence does not translate to an increase in personal or certainly community safety.
Absolutely. There's a part of this that you kind of are touching on is like history repeats itself. Like that's the
Oh, yeah.
singular thought that I'm like thinking as you're speaking about this. And when you were going through some of that history, you get towards the end where we're at now, this present day, this policing of bodies and this demonization of sexuality and all the rest. But I'm curious if you wouldn't mind speaking to like the origin when you're talking about like these deities and these goddesses, because I don't know that that's as well known
Sure.
as the history we're living and reliving today.
Yeah, and that history has been sort of like continually like rediscovered and erased also in cycles, if that makes sense. So
Yes.
yeah, so everywhere in the world, everywhere you look, right, we find big, powerful fertility goddesses that like are in their erotic power, right? Whether you're talking about Ishtar, right, god of or goddess of love and war from ancient Babylon. You're talking about Tlazolteotl, who was a deity that people confessed to on their deathbed in the like Aztec Empire of Mesopotamia, the Sheila na gig of Ireland. There are like so many, literally every continent you find these big, powerful fertility deities, and they're often, what like archaeologists, especially like the racist ones in the 19th century, were calling like an older primitive religion, right? Of like, how dare you worship the bodies that bring life into this world. And there are a couple of you're talking about like the life death life cycle that's often held within our bodies. You're often talking about like powerful erotic energy, and sometimes you see exchanges, right, of priestesses engaged in either like erotic dance that is like sort of ritualistic or symbolic of sex, or actual literal sex. And so you see this pattern, like Anana like descending into the underworld and then coming sort of back up. You see this like seasonal turnover where often, a priestess representing like the goddess, or like this sort of powerful like uh there's a great author I love who calls them like sex and death goddesses, but it is like at her pleasure that like the king or like the shepherd god serves. And so there's often this sort of like ritualistic coupling that comes together. And so he is like serving at her pleasure. And in many parts of the world, if he fails to live up to her expectations, like if he doesn't make her come, then that's followed by ritualistic castration. Sometimes this is a dance, sometimes this is literal, sometimes the dance is, remembering an earlier time when the castration and or the sex was more literal. But you see this pattern over and over again of priestess prostitutes effectively not only choosing like the king, but also manning the temple, which is like the great organizing institution of the ancient world, right? Like the temple, especially of these like powerful goddesses that have anything to do with the harvest. This is the center, right? This is where people go not just to worship, but also to make every major decision in the ancient world. This is the ancient bank. This is the ancient gathering place. This is the space where information about how to encourage or prevent pregnancy, or how to help women give birth, which is a really, really important part of our species history. Like, not to nerd out too hard about, like, we would not have made it past the Homo erectus stage, but for midwifery being like a real skill that is passed on from one generation to the next. And these like sort of life, death, life goddesses create the institutions create the spaces where that knowledge is passed down from one generation to the next. So yeah, I don't want to generalize too much, but everywhere you look, you find examples of these kinds of sacred gathering places that are often facilitated by, encouraged by, shrouded in the kind of erotic power that evolves into our concept of the sacred whore that we still see everywhere in sex work and in art and in our lives.
Another thing you said that I would like to kind of expand on too, because I just think it's so important for our community, especially to know and understand, is your mention of like how sex workers kind of built the world as it is today. Can you
Mm-hmm.
like go a little bit deeper on that? Because I think that this is so important for community members to
Sure.
realize.
Yeah, I mean, like we built the internet, right? That's for sure, for sure. Like we would not sex workers have always been at the cutting edge of every financial, cultural, technological innovation for all of human history. Part of that is from necessity, right? As a member of a criminalized and stigmatized class, we are often trying to stay one step ahead of like regulators, which has turned us into early adopters. But the internet, like the ability to pay for porn, the ability to create spaces, the ability to advertise our services, like sex workers in so many ways. I want to use the word colonized here, but I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. But we really did create the basic infrastructure that people now enjoy for their like very mundane online shopping tools. But it's like easier for your husband to like, or it's, whatever. Sorry, I was slipping into my weird personal example of like, my husband's the one that orders toilet paper in our house. But like the infrastructure of that like online commerce was built by and for sex workers initially. And there's so many examples of that. We've always been, for example, at the cutting edge of advertising. There are all of these really fun stories from ancient Rome of people having sandals that had the imprint of like follow me to the brothel, form of like early guerrilla advertising. Brothels themselves have been incredibly important incubator spaces for arts. Early brothels have been theaters and concert halls and libraries. Sex workers are often some of the first settlers to arrive in new spaces. Part of that is, you know, uh, maybe running away from stigma, running towards new market opportunities. But for example, like New Orleans was straight up built by sex workers. We were some of the first people to arrive from France, first white people. France actually sent shipfuls of sex workers. And the brothel culture that we created in New Orleans created the conditions that led to jazz music, right? Brothels wanted musicians just kind of riffing for hours on end, which was a real break from the more sort of traditional concert or like song, the way that music had been consumed before. Theater is a really good example of this. I mean, go into any art museum and you're going to see sex workers all over the walls, right? We have been influencing those spaces for literally all of human history.
What I'm hearing is sex workers are the original influencers.
Yeah, correct. Literally the only reason that we know Mark Antony's name, right, from ancient Greece ancient Rome, is because his favorite courtesan, Lycoris, was like one of the first PR people. She was just really, really good at spinning like Mark Antony's whole deal. Like
That's so
it's
crazy.
it's crazy. And think about this. Sex workers, not in spite of our status as sex workers, but because of our status as sex workers, have enjoyed more freedom of movement than women who were playing the like respectability game, right? So we get our freedom of movement back when we are willing to trade our chastity for that, because we're no longer protecting ourselves from the appearance of impropriety. And in Venice, for example, for hundreds of years, the only women who were legally allowed to enter the public libraries were courtesans. The wives of Venice were barred from that because the thinking was that promiscuity of the mind led to promiscuity of the body. And they were willing to do anything to protect the, paternity and the, by extension, sexual chastity of the next generation. So if you were even the wealthiest wife in Venice, you weren't necessarily like allowed to read. But Veronica Franco, became a very famous writer, editor, advocate for women, celebrated poet, and ambassador, not in spite of her status as a courtesan, but only because she was a courtesan. Because she wouldn't have been allowed in the room had she been somebody's wife.
That's a really wild one to think about, actually. And you said something there that stood out is like the trading of chastity for like that status that these like wives would have, for example. But
Yeah.
it makes me think about too, in like modern day, it's really like almost trading shame for authenticity. Like once you can give
Yeah.
that up, you have so much more freedom of just in
Yes.
everything, when you're
Yes.
not weighing all your decisions on what everyone might think of you. Like what a powerful position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something
Absolutely.
something else you said really stood out, and this was about kind of like the criminalized and stigmatized class. I'm wondering, how do systemic issues like racism, transphobia, which you kind of touched on, and
Hmm.
then just economic inequality, sorry, how it makes sex workers even more vulnerable to violence, and like how do you think we can address this and like these kind of layers in our advocacy?
Well, it's really interesting because, of course, stigma compounds, right? And the most vulnerable amongst us are, sex workers who, have unconventional gender identity, members of the queer community, black or brown, or like a historically or currently, excuse me, over policed community, immigrants, migrants, people with, vulnerable status in some way, and also, of course, people that don't have access to resources. But sex work gives people access to resources that they might not otherwise have. It's a very old survival strategy for a reason. But I think that we have so much to learn, or I have so much to learn from communities that have come together facing sort of like multiple stigmas. Like the first, we say that like Coyote, Margaret St. James founded like one of the first sex worker led organizations in the country, Coyote, call off your old tired ethics. But 5 years before she founded Coyote, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Riviera founded an organization for trans youth participating in sex work, survival sex work. And in many ways started what we recognize as the gay rights movement, right? By like throwing the shot glass heard around the world at Stonewall. The first country to decriminalize prostitution, New Zealand, did so in 2003, also the same year of International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. It was a big year for sex worker organizing, in part because Georgina Beyer, the first trans woman elected, or the first out trans woman elected to any parliament anywhere in the world, had lived experience as a sex worker and made it happen. And so although you see sex workers that have like access to privilege historically, the kind of like community uprising that really leads to like long-term change, not just for individuals, but for entire communities, comes out of some of the most marginalized communities amongst us.
Yeah, it really does. And then you started to kind of also touch on just decriminalization of prostitution
Yes.
from one angle of that story. I'm wondering, from a policy standpoint, what steps, I guess, really need to be taken to reduce violence against sex workers? Like, are there current movements or
Yes.
legislation, that you're excited about or even concerned about?
Yeah, yes to all of it. The first and most important step is to stop the arrests, is to stop the state hunting sex workers or trying to arrest us, our loved ones, our landlords, our clients, anyone that we work with. Once sex workers are no longer facing the threat of arrest, that enables us to report violence committed against us, to come together to advocate for safer, healthier working conditions, to do a lot of things. So in New Zealand, for example, there have been sex workers who have successfully sued brothel managers for sexual harassment. There have been sex workers who have won criminal complaints against clients that slipped a condom off and turned what could have been a consensual negotiated session into sexual assault. There have been sex workers who have organized and come together. The New Zealand NZPC, New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, or like they prefer the New Zealand Sex Workers Collective, but the acronym is from an older generation, have literal clinics all over the country staffed by sex worker informed professionals, right? Doctors, counselors, social workers that are able to provide up-to-date information and resources to sex workers all over the country. There's a lot that's possible when you are not spending 70% of your energy trying to obscure your identity or hide from the cops. Belgium, I think, is a really fascinating, interesting, recent example. Belgium became the first country in Europe to decriminalize sex work just a couple of years ago. And they became the first country in the world this year to successfully advocate for worker protections that were specific to sex workers. So sex workers in Belgium now have not just retirement and paid leave, but they also have maternity leave, they have worker protections, they have contract protections. And so I'm really excited to see how that system evolves in Belgium. On the other side, of course, this impulse to try to eradicate prostitution in the name of protecting vulnerable people from it continues to be very, very appealing to policymakers all over the world. So Sweden became the first country to criminalize clients in 1999. That idea spread to Norway and Iceland in 2009. And now there are lots of countries, including ours, experimenting with ways of criminalizing clients or third-party folks. But everywhere this policy has been implemented, violence against sex workers goes up because it reduces our negotiating power. It makes us more vulnerable to eviction, deportation, and critically, makes it harder for us to make or keep our money. And of course, financial precarity has never reduced someone's vulnerability to violence or exploitation or predators of all kinds.
Yeah. There's so much going on with policy, and it affects us a lot. And there's a lot going on obviously with advocacy that's trying to change a lot of these things. I find that like grassroots organizing, it's always been kind of this cornerstone for sex
Yes.
worker advocacy. What are some of the, I guess, most inspiring examples that you've seen of sex workers building these like safety nets and advocating for the community
Sure.
together?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I do want to say, because I know that we have possibly a mostly US folks listening, and I want to say
Mhm.
that there are some really exciting things happening right now in the US. Like New York, for example, is looking at a decrim bill in the assembly next year. There's been several years that they've been pushed. There's a lot of co-sponsors and a lot of folks that are behind that, and that's because sex workers have spent really like the last, well, really for decades, but especially the last few years, doing the painstaking work of building coalitions and educating lawmakers on their own constituency. And you see that in Oregon, you see that in New Hampshire, you see that in Massachusetts, like pockets of sex workers who are taking it upon themselves to reach out, find community, which is a really critical ingredient whenever you're taking on something like policy change, and then leveraging that community to educate policymakers, often at great personal expense and sometimes the threat of their own anonymity. It's very difficult to come out as a sex worker, especially in a small community. It's very difficult to testify in front of legislators, but it's really, really critical work, because when our voices are not included the people that are claiming to speak for us don't have smart, sane things to say.
No, you're absolutely right. It's interesting because like these same, I guess, pieces of logic or components, like you speak to the recipe idea,
Mm-hmm.
which I love because it's so
Yeah.
like easy to comprehend. But like even with what we're doing, like the community as a whole and keeping everyone together, informed and having access to information, like that's one part of that recipe. But then there's like the other part, which is like the data and trying to
Yes.
survey creators and really get the truth and the result of their shared experiences in a data set that we can
Mm-hmm.
show Congress and show legislators, like, hey, we have real data that proves the evidence that we're being discriminated against financially in terms of institutions and so much else. So like getting the recipe right and having all kind of pieces of that recipe in place, I think is how you can impact change over time. And it is painstaking work, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
And it does kind of take us back to the grassroots organizing, because some of the most, successful campaigns are from sex workers taking parts of that recipe and pulling it off.
Absolutely. And I think that it sort of speaks to the genius behind the initial December 17th ritual and ceremony, because it so effectively brings us together with the right energy, right? That vigil, that sense of this the sense of the importance of the work that we're doing, right? We're not just here to advocate for ourselves, we're here to advocate for those that we've lost, right? We're here to try to create a future where everyone has access to the basic building blocks they need to move their lives forward, where nobody is arrested, evicted, fired, or loses custody of their kids just because they do this work, right? Where sex workers have access to not just banking and advertising platforms, but to justice. Like we should be able to report crimes committed against us to the police, right? We should be able to stand together in a non-controversial way against serial killers and serial predators that prey not just on our communities, but on the community, because we are members of that community. And standing together, reading the names, lighting the candles, breaking bread, taking part in crafts, making eye contact with each other. It's all an important part of strengthening that foundational community that allows us to go out there and continue to advocate and continue to fight for a better future for the next generation.
It really does. And again, like that humanizing of sex worker stories, highlighting their families, naming the names. I feel like there's a parallel there in, the podcasts and the performances that you
Mm-hmm.
put on as well, because you do get to humanize sex workers to an audience of people, to inform people and educate people in a way that they're, consuming or find consumable. I'm wondering if there's like a favorite story or maybe a moment that you've shared that you think resonates deeply with this day.
I mean, I think it's difficult. I'm based in New York, and the Long Island serial killer was just charged with a another murder, and it's very difficult to think about the years that I spent, working here and continuing to work with other sex worker rights advocates, and knowing that our community, members of our community, have had information that could have stopped this predator sooner, but for the stigma and the criminalization of our work, we couldn't take that to law enforcement, right? We couldn't stop this predator. Joey the player is a recent example. He was a horrible person based in New Jersey who was not killing, but regularly preying on and sexually assaulting and robbing sex workers in the tri-state area. And sex workers came together. They worked with SWAT Behind Bars. They created an intermediary to help protect their identity and their rights. And they worked with law enforcement and specifically the FBI to bring this guy to justice. So that's a recent inspiring story of sex workers coming together and trying to work around a system that has been so effectively built to keep us quiet and afraid.
Yeah, it's you're centered in New York, and you're mentioning these things around that area, and you also named that New York's got this, these bills on the table for
Hmm.
decrim that are so exciting, and I do want to kind of wrap things and head towards a positive note. And one of the things that I love about New York is the history of how sex workers built it, and like I just think it's so like inspiring and exciting because I feel like, people look at the US or they look at something like New York, and it's
Hmm.
such a pinnacle city of a superpower in the world at least for the moment. And I wanted to know if you could just speak and like tell us a little bit about that sex worker history in New York specifically, because I just find it so interesting.
I mean, like so many great cities, right?
Mhm.
Like we helped build this town. Like you don't get uh huge chunks of like New York is not New York without our history of brothel culture, right? Without our history of sex workers being a part of every major art movement, every major theater movement. In fact, there's a woman I'm learning about now. We're doing an episode about her next year. Robyn Bird was she was a survival sex worker. She ran away from home when she was like 13. She became a nude model and then became a porn star. She was actually featured in like Debbie Does Dallas, which is like one of the most famous porns from like the porn chic era. And then she parlayed that into hosting what would become the Robyn Bird show on this least cable access television, which was a new technology, right? So it's an example of a sex worker using, right, their sex work, the access to that, and taking advantage of a new form of communication, which was this least public access channel. And she becomes a local celebrity and she hosts this show, which aired only in Manhattan, because that's the airtime that she leased from like 1979 until 1998, nearly 30 years on the air. During the AIDS epidemic, she brought on other sex workers to interview. There's some of the first trans representation on screen ever was like on her show. And she's this hyper local celebrity, but she's a local celebrity in the media capital of the world. So she influences a generation of content creators and producers, and it literally like sort of changed the face of television through her tenacity and innovation and being somebody who was in the right place at the right time. And I was talking with her because she doesn't consider herself an activist. Like she's never like, the only time that she was ever on a picket line was when like Time Warner was trying to scramble her show for obscenity, because of course they were, and she like fought back against that. But she wasn't a part of the proper like her contemporaries in the sex worker rights movement, right? The Club 90 girls, Annie Sprinkle, like they're all contemporaries of each other. But Robyn Bird wasn't a part of that scene. She wasn't doing like picket line or protest advocacy. But what she did was she created a safe space that was publicly accessible to millions and millions of people and showed millions and millions of viewers what acceptance and safety looks like. She created a world where it was okay to be a sex worker. It was okay to be gay. It was okay to be trans. It was okay to participate in orgies. It was okay to wear a knit bikini on television. And she just created that space and then showed other people what it looks like. And I think that that's so much of how sex workers can use art and media and storytelling and like the dream work of world building, right? To help show people an alternative by creating it ourselves. And one of the gifts of being outside of the mainstream, right? One of the gifts of being a member of a historically stigmatized community is that we get to play outside of the box. We get to think outside of the structures that already exist, and we have the creative capacity to do things differently.
Yeah, I think that is such a she's the, one of the first influencer proper on
Yeah,
broadcast media
she
influencers, and
really is.
that's
She had like a
amazing.
YouTube channel before, decades before YouTube.
I think that the way that you speak of her and like her legacy and how also too she doesn't realize the that she's in advocacy
Hmm.
necessarily. I think that is something a lot of, the adult creators listening here today can really kind of take away with too, is like you can do advocacy through your work, through the channels you have access to. You can
Absolutely.
impact change and inform people, and especially your audience who cares about what you think. They,
Yeah.
they subscribe for you, they follow you, they retweet you, they whatever. So I think that's a powerful place to kind of wrap things up. I do want to ask though, for those that are listening today or who will listen to this episode in the future, who do want to honor and make a difference, what are, I guess, some of the concrete actions they can take, like whether they're in the industry or their allies?
I think knowledge is really powerful. And so I think educating yourself about the history of sex worker advocacy and those that have come before you, right? Like whatever you're doing, you have a predecessor from the vaudeville world, right? From earlier generations of people that are doing what you do. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in knowing that like maybe history doesn't literally repeat itself, but it rhymes, I think is the old saying. And so helping to understand how censorship tools or criminalization or licensing schemes have been used against sex workers in the past helps us prepare for the way that those same impulses will manifest even with a new technology, right? I also think it's really important for us to never forget that we are part of a proud legacy. There's so much stigma. There's so much misinformation about what it means to engage in this work. So buttressing yourself with stories of, your lineage of people that you can be proud of, I think is really important for moving through this world, not just as an unapologetic, but as a proud member of this community.
I love the way you phrase that as your lineage. I think
Thank
that's
you.
such a powerful term. Um, what message would you like to, I guess, leave the community with as we are reflecting on the significance of today?
Today is a day where we come together and we mourn those that we have lost. And it can be overwhelming thinking about what the stigma and criminalization and the lies that we've told about sex work has cost us, right? Not just in this generation, but in all of the generations past. But just in coming together and honoring the people who were a part of, like, recognizing that we are all a part of this community is a revolutionary act in and of itself. So anything that you can do to feel connected to your fellow sex workers today is honoring the day. It doesn't have to look, and that's the great wisdom, right, of like Robyn Bird's advocacy that like looks like making this like fun, silly TV show that people fell in love with for 30 years, right? Like you can connect in ways that feel good to you, and it doesn't have to look like it does for everyone else.
I think that's so perfect. I want to wrap up here by just mentioning, because the work you do, the work you're doing with Old Pros, with everything, I'm obsessed with your podcast, your
Oh, thank
newsletter,
you.
just all the things you touch.
Thank
Where
you.
can everyone tuning in, or who will listen to this episode later, how can they support your work and stay connected to the things you're doing?
I do want to say, because I think that you have an audience of adult content creators, that I'm going to be doing a very special performance of Whore's Eye View at the University of Las Vegas, Nevada on January 23rd, which is when the AVNs are happening. So it's a free, I
I'm so
know.
excited.
So the information for where the show is happening is on my website. I believe that it is free, but you have to register to attend, and it's going to be held at the Goldfield Room in the Lead Library at the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, at 6 p.m. On January 23rd. And it is part of the Erotic Labor in the 21st Century Conference, Unpacking Power, Pleasure, and Resistance. So,
Exciting.
yeah, I'm excited. So I'd love to see you there. If you are a member of this community and you do come to a show, please stick around. One of my favorite parts of touring the world with this show is being able to connect to other people that do this work everywhere. I want to hug you. I want to hear your story. I want to connect specifically with the sex workers that come out to see this show. And of course, there's not just that performance. I'm going to be continuing to tour the show. And you can sign up for our newsletter at oldprosonline.org. You can also follow us on social media, but I don't think it's not a secret amongst sex workers that those platforms are becoming less and less reliable for our ability to reach our audience. So the most reliable way to stay in the know, like an old pro, and up to date with new podcast episodes and tour performances and sex worker rights related news from all over the world is to sign up directly for our newsletter at oldprosonline.org.
Also, your socials, your personal
Oh
socials.
yes, you can follow me at Kaytlin Bailey. It is spelled unusually.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kaytlin. This was amazing. You provide so
Oh,
much value
thank
every time
you.
you come. I
Oh, thank
always
you
learn
so
something new.
much.
We love having you. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Mel. I really appreciate what you're putting out in the world. I feel it's a real gift that I stumbled onto your content, and I love what you're putting out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. I do want to, I guess, since this is actually the last space that we're going to do for
Mm.
this year, I should acknowledge and highlight just kind of a few things before we close out today. I think firstly, I really want to stress like how much it means to us that everyone here is tuning in, week after week. Just you guys being here in real time is a massive gift, honestly, to us alone. And it's not only because, you take part in these conversations in real time or you comment on them or sometimes you guys are co-hosting them with us, but it's also because other adult creators can see you listening live and then they join themselves. So you listening and being here weekly, it helps us grow our community, and that means a lot to us. It helps us get closer to our missions here at SWCEO and just every adjacent company aligned. But beyond that, like these episode recordings, they air on our podcast, right? So many of you will re-listen to them or you'll hear them for the very first time in a podcast episode. And we were looking last week, and our podcast has grown by 72% this year. And it's no surprise because just so many of you guys took part in the conversations. Either you listened to it, you were speakers, or you were guests yourselves. And when you guys were tagging us, for showing up in your Spotify Wrapped at the end of the year, it just felt like such a wow moment for us inside Sexwork CEO. Like our Spotify data put us as the top 10 listened to podcast for over 552 of our fans, which is just crazy to me. And we're getting these 5-star ratings across our platform. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is that if you're hearing this now, take a moment to rate us if you haven't, officially follow the podcast if you haven't. It helps way more than you know. And it's just deeply validating for what we're trying to do here as well. I do want to reiterate that our live Twitter spaces are going to return next year, January 28th, 2025, after the January industry conferences, after Kaytlin Bailey's show tour in Vegas. Make sure you're there. And you're also going to see this kind of pause reflected in our podcast episode publishing as well. As many of you have seen, we have been kind of putting out a lot more content over our YouTube channel. And in 2025, we plan to put out at least one new video course out on that channel every single week. So if you're not subscribed to us over on YouTube, please take a moment to do that. It's youtube.com/SWCEO. And just make sure you have notifications on so that you never miss a video. For those who kind of missed the beginning of this space, I do want to take a moment to mention GPTs again. It's something we worked really hard on, and I think it will help you save time and make money in your business. GPTs is essentially this NSFW AI chat tool, very similar to ChatGPT, except it's built by an adult creator, me, and it's also for adult creators specifically. So whether you need, 15 solo content ideas for OnlyFans, or you need help captioning a PPV for, say, a fetish clip, or crafting a viral tweet for your socials, like even just being inspired on what to reply back to a fan in DMs or writing a video script, literally the possibilities are endless. And it's a free tool. At base level, you can use it completely free. We wanted to make sure everyone in our community had some level of access to this. It was really important to kind of our philosophy here at SexWorks CEO. And I want to stress that you can personalize GPTs. So with your style, your tone of voice, your niche, even the emojis you use, you can literally make this tool truly yours. It is made by us for us. It's going to save you time, make you more money in your business, and it in no way replaces you as a creator or just it doesn't diminish your creative vision, but it'll rather help act as an extension of you. So if you were listening to this episode carefully, or maybe some of our past ones, we have actually been dropping some Easter eggs about news related to GPTs. So it's been happening subtly. You probably missed it. I can't wait to hear all about when you figure it out. But if you keep an eye on your emails from GPTs this week, you will notice a Christmas gift that we are putting together for all of you. So if that piques your curiosity and you haven't tried it yet, you can try GPTs for free by visiting gpts.ai. That's gptease.ai. And again, tweet us with any of your feedback at gptsai on socials, because we'd love to keep making this better for you. Lastly, if you're not part of the club, you're just not a part of the club. I mean, I'm talking about CEO Society. It is our private adult creator only community where we share strategies, tips, and resources outside of the prying eyes of fans. So this is kind of a place where creators can speak freely, share, post studies, case studies of things that are being tested that is working for them, and just generally support each other as other adult entrepreneurs. We're all walking these same paths and discovering ourselves along the same journey. I felt alone a lot in this industry, and we kind of talked about that inside this episode, but inside CEO Society, that's just not the case. So if you like the stuff I talk about, business-wise, entrepreneurially, just imagine how much more you're going to love hearing business insights from an even larger variety of creators with additional lenses and experiences that I can't speak to. So joining CEO Society, again, it's completely free. You can simply click the link in the pinned tweet at the top of this space or in the description of this podcast episode once it airs. Either way, it is ceosociety.app if you want to join us, because we can't wait to see you over there. If you haven't already heard or somehow caught on, that's going to bring us to the end of today's space, and this is the last one of 2024. So huge thank you to everyone who joined in. Remember, all of these spaces get turned into blog posts over on our website, SWCEO.com. Our live spaces will resume on January 28th, 2025. And remember, you'll see that same pause reflected in our podcast publishing schedule as well. When we come back next year, some of the things are going to be a little bit different. They're going to sound a little bit different. The guests are going to be a little bit bigger, and the business strategy will be even more tactical, and the information, I'm hoping, will be even more insightful. That is our promise to all of you here. And in return, our only ask is that you come back and hold us accountable for it. So we'll see you all in 2025 CEO Squad. Thank you so much for tuning in.
It would be absolutely incredible if you rated this podcast 5 stars and left a little review. We want to get this podcast to as many adult creators as possible, and you taking a second to leave a couple stars and a review really helps us do that. Thanks so much.